Somebody asked, how do you keep code clean when you start a project? What should you do to prevent your code from becoming a total disaster? The first thing you got to do is you got to set up protocols. You got to set up certain protocols within the coding to make sure that people follow these protocols. What's a protocol? Things like naming conventions in terms of variables, files, database tables, and so on. So you want to set up a protocol in that regard. That will go a long way. You set up certain rules like no God methods. If you see there's more than 3 or 4 things that a particular method does, a particular function does, then as a protocol, you've got to break it up into simpler functions. No massive classes as well. Another thing you can do is you can have a senior developer who you trust, maybe that's yourself, maybe it's somebody else, who does a code review maybe once a week just to go over things before it gets too big and stupid. Another thing you could do is you could start using frameworks. So let's say we are doing a web app. So when you're building a web app of any decent size, you're going to be using one of the popular frameworks that are out there. And you want to use one of the popular ones so that you don't find yourself in some sort of niche, barely used technology where it would be very difficult to find somebody to work on it. So if you're in PHP, you would probably these days use Laravel. If you are in Java, you would use Java Spring. If you are in the JavaScript on the server side, you probably would use Node.js, and on top of that, Express.js. Now this will change with time and depending on what's popular, what's in, depending on the circumstances. But by using a framework that is well defined, this forces a set of protocols, a set of rules for your programmers to work within. So that's another thing. And finally, and it goes along with the protocols again, I use the word protocol loosely, I can't think of a better term. But another thing you can do is set certain design patterns that you insist upon. So when you're using a framework like a Laravel, for instance, the main design pattern for a web app is MVC, Model View Controller. And they use that in iOS app development and all over the place. So that is a pattern you can specify. Another design pattern you can specify is no inheritance in your objects. Rather, you use interfaces. That's one thing you can specify. You can look at different patterns, perhaps, that are your favorite design patterns in code that you would want to have implemented on a consistent basis with some exceptions. With every rule, there is always exceptions. Keep that in mind. When I was much more active in developing apps, I would always use MVC, Model View Controller. I would use the filter pattern a lot, which is in the Java Spring framework. That would be dependency injection. In Java servlets, that would be called, they would call these servlet filters. And that's because I just imagined all my apps as being a flow of data, kind of like a river of data. So when you use filters, the filter pattern, you're filtering the data, you're injecting a filter at different points to modify the flow of this information. And that's how I looked at it. So I would use MVC, I would use servlet filters, which is kind of like dependency injection, but on the servlet level. If you don't know what servlets are, they are the basic structure of a dynamic web app in the Java world. You don't have to worry about that only if you get into Java. And there's a few other, I like using Facade a lot. But so these were the 3 main patterns that I would use over and over and over. Obviously designed by interface rather than designed by inheritance. And I've talked about this in other videos. So there you go. Keep your code clean by, at the very start of the project, you set up certain standards, certain protocols, and which everybody should adhere to, and maybe on a weekly basis do a quick code review to make sure nobody's going nuts, nobody's going off on a tangent. I hope that helps. Bye-bye.